Good morning, everyone. I think the doors are open, people are joining us, but it's 11 o'clock, so on with the show. Good morning, I'm Jonathan Werran. I'm the Chief Executive of Localist, the place-focused think tank, and a very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us today for the second of our look at housing and planning issues. Today's event is around placemaking and the role of the community. And the essay question today is there a place for community in planning for the future? I guess many of the people joining us today will be either having sent your submission or on the cusp of getting it before tomorrow's deadline for getting a submission in. What we want to debate today with our expert panel, who I will introduce shortly, is really to get a fix on, in terms of the role of community under planning for the future, under the reforms. There's a lot of good localist talk in the paper, but really, how strongly operationally do we feel community input will be available in terms of how we shape the design of the neighbourhoods, of the homes and communities we're looking to create in the future? So really, we want to ask, is there a genuine role for placemaking in community-led development? I've got an expert panel, so I'm going to stop blathering on now to get them to talking to us. I've got Professor Councillor Samir Begin from Brighton and Hove City Council. We've also got Victoria Hills, Chief Executive of the RTPI, Catriona Riddell, National Strategic Planning Specialist for the Planning Officer Society, Andrew Taylor, Group Planning Director, Countryside, and Andy von Bradsky, Head of Design, MHCLG. So the format is I'm going to invite each of our panelists to unmute, introduce themselves, give us a short introduction, maybe 2 to 4 minutes, of what they see as most important around the role of community in how we plan for the future. And after then, we'll have a debate between the panel, and I will open it up to our audience. Put in your questions in the Q&A box. We will seek to answer as many as we can as possible. We're also pursuing this on Twitter. I'll put on the chat box the hashtag for today, which is hashtag #4community, plan for community, for those following by Twitter. So let's get on with the show. I'm going to invite Samir to unmute and introduce yourself and tell us what you think is most important to community-led design for the future. Samir.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Jonathan. And thank you for that kind introduction. I suspect I'm fortunate in that where I sit on Brighton and Hove City Council, I bring a lot of baggage to that post, but that's baggage, I think, because that's, baggage having studied architecture way back at the Bartlett, and then urban design, and then planning, and then, practiced as a planner, and then sitting in a local authority. And I'm also fortunate that I teach planners, which is a fantastic place to be, I think, at this given moment in time. One of my other hats is that I am trying to get a neighborhood forum off the ground, having worked with one previously back in the early days of neighborhood planning. So it's an interesting view, if you like, where communities sit with respect to the planning white paper. I think engagement more broadly. Certainly, I'm just going to come out and say it. I mean, I think the proposals are, where I sit, an improvement on the current situation. Certainly as far as community engagement is concerned, I suspect that, front-loading applications or the plan-making process itself with that community engagement piece will be better than the current situation. And I'll tell you why I say that. There's different things going on, again, in the neighborhoods around me that make me say that. And one of those is that I'm struggling to get planning agents and developers to engage with the local community effectively. Now, I sit on planning committees occasionally and I hear officers say, well, we've done the statutory consultation bit, But then I hear communities saying, well, that's not good enough because we know nothing about this. So there is obviously that tension going on. And within the community, which is the usual story, you have the people who are heavily engaged, the people who are, for us as councillors, who are on email every day saying, when is this going to committee? When is this going to committee? What are you doing about it? And so on. Why doesn't anybody else know about this? And the answer coming back is, well, everybody knows about it, but just everybody is not necessarily engaged, or they don't have the same interest in knowing where this is going on. Now, can front-loading help all of that? I don't know, but I think if you make communities part of the decision-making process early on, I think it will. Because at the moment, again, the way I see it is community groups, neighborhood forums, various individuals coming into a committee, whether virtually or in person, saying a few words and leaving, isn't necessarily working the way it was intended to be, because there's no influence, there's no power, if you like, within the equation. We were talking to our planning theory students yesterday about power and influence, going all the way back to the 1970s. And we've lost that, that's not there. There is a mention of community engagement. There's going through the motions of engaging with a community. But, I'm still seeing, and we had this last week, we had a planning agent saying, well, we're going to leaflet the neighborhood. And so, well, the last meaningful engagement activity was in November 2018. That's 2 years ago for an application which is still in pre-app. So that didn't go anywhere. And then they didn't even have suppliers to distribute leaflets. So we've got our own supply, we can give you that. Now, you shouldn't really be in 2020 at this point where you're delivering leaflets to houses, because a lot of people will say they've not got them, or they've not seen them, or they got pinned and so on. So there are issues with how we engage, which is, I think, where this digital element of the planning white paper comes in, and it's really important. We've tried to introduce digital tools and a couple of platforms into a council. Money was the object, but we're now trying to do it through the neighborhood forum, which I think is probably more effective. The other thing I would say is, and I'm hoping my colleagues have responded to question 26 in the planning white paper, which is not a question I've seen a lot of stuff about, which is, do you have any views on the potential impact of the proposals on people with protected characteristics? And that's a struggle. We've got a big allocation in Hove that sits on the edge of one of the most diverse communities in Brighton and Hove, and they know nothing about it. It's been in the pipeline for a long time. It went into the city plan in 2015, and they don't know anything about it. And that's a big challenge. So how do you reach over to the people who are there, who want to engage, but the system itself is actually failing them clearly? That's the current system. And I will leave it at that for now, Jonathan, if that's okay. I think there's quite a few things there for us to tease out as we go along.
Samir, thank you very much for getting us off to such a good, strong start there. Victoria, we're very keen to hear from you and a view from the RTPI.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for the opportunity to join this fabulous panel. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I'll try not to take too long. And obviously I'll keep my powder dry a little bit in terms of the exact, bang, if you like, the big unveil when we go live or go big with our big response that we've been working up to. It's been a long 12 weeks, but we're nearly there at the finishing line. However, I'm just picking up on a couple of points that Samir mentioned. We don't see it as an either or. We absolutely welcome this front-loaded upstream engagement. But the downstream engagement that may disappear in the renewal zones, this is an area of interest for us, because of course what you don't want to do in engaging the community upstream and I'm talking about local plans here, I'll come on to neighbourhood plans in a moment, it then disenfranchise them downstream when they perhaps they didn't live in the area when the upstream was done, or perhaps they thought they may get involved in stuff downstream, because of course we have been for the last 70 years. So we are talking about a big cultural change here, and I think it's worth mentioning the word cultural change in the context of community. Now, you know that we've made a big bang. Hopefully you heard about it in terms of our comprehensive spending review submission, only to be scuppered by the Chancellor last week when he drew away the rug of the CSR. But we're not going to go away quietly on that point. We will continue to bang the drum for resourcing on Invest and Prosper, our business case to government for funding planning in England. We've made a really big pitch there for plan making fund, for capacity building, but also a placemaking fund and very much public engagement fund as well within that, because we think what the pandemic has done is many, many things, but it has shone a light on the community, the importance of the area that you live in, because you're spending far more time living and working in that area and playing in that area than you would have done previously. We're traveling around less. We're very, very community focused. We are discovering or rediscovering parts of our community that we didn't know were there or haven't been to for some time. And so we think this is a real opportunity for planning for the future to capitalise on this new revigored interest in the community, to work with the community on these huge ambitions that the government has for delivering growth, for delivering green recovery, for delivering the rebalancing of the economy, if you like, what we hear about. Lots on that. So we think there is a really strong role here for neighbourhood planning going forward. We would like to see a little bit more definition from the government as to where they see that, but certainly where we see it is the opportunity to engage with the community locally. The opportunity, really, it's a two-way relationship. What the community have is that fine-grained knowledge, that heritage knowledge, the existing detailed knowledge of sites, of history, of what the community needs, actually. Now, some planners have that knowledge, but actually, if they don't live and work in that community, they may not have that knowledge. So what's in it for the planners is to tap into that fine-grained knowledge. And I should also say they've got local politicians, of course, who do live in the area, but many of the planners may not. But what's in it for the community is they can get a greater understanding of what this planning system is. And so it's this two-way flow of knowledge, which, why would you bother? Well, hopefully it leads to better outcomes. Ultimately, it leads to the community feeling engaged and ownership of growth rather than perhaps being averse to it and understanding why. But we think this neighbourhood planning ability that's been around for a while now provides an opportunity for communities to engage not just in numbers or location, but actually holding everybody's feet to the fire on some really important issues like climate action, carbon neutral, saying we embrace development, but you're not building here unless you deliver X, Y, and Z. So actually being very involved in some of those carbon discussions. Heritage also really, really important. No developer, even with the best heritage experts in the lands, may not have that local fine-grained granularity that the community have from people who've lived there for some time. So we think retain neighbourhood planning, boost investment in engagement for the local plan. If you don't, but clarity is needed in planning for the future. And we think some of the role and purpose and function of neighbourhood planning has not been detailed in the proposals to date. Clearly there's questions in there to be answered, but they do need to be answered. Otherwise you could end up in further delays and frustrations because the community on the one hand thought that you meant this, whereas the local planning authority interpretation of it is something quite different. So resourcing, avoiding frustrations and democratic deficit downstream. We think we just need to be really careful on that cultural change and being very open and upfront with the community upstream. If they're not going to get involved downstream, you need to be clear about that right at the get-go. And I think the last point I would just mention, and we're talking about community and involvement, is we've also asked for a big investment in digital. We think this is part of the solution, but it's not the silver bullet to engaging community. And certainly my experience, the best community engagement that I ever did in my last job at Old Oak was where we held physical events like tea parties and got the community in on a Saturday afternoon to talk about what was important to them. They didn't realise they were talking about planning per se, but they were talking about planning matters. So I would summarise with engagement, digital investment, resourcing, And yeah, there is a bright opportunity here for all of this if they get it right in planning for the future. Thank you very much.
Victoria, many thanks indeed. And what a nice bright note to end. Community engagement, street parties, once all this is over, who knows? Thank you very much. I'm going to next invite Catriona to share your thoughts and views as to the role of community in planning for the future. Please, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan, and good morning, everyone. And I guess mine really follows on from what Samir and Victoria said. And I get there's sort of three main points I would make. The first one is that, how do you define community? And I think that there is an assumption in the white paper, which I think is quite wrong, around community being the neighbourhoods and the people that engage in the planning system. And actually, we've got a whole load of different communities that should engage, especially if this is about creating good places and delivering long-term sustainable growth. There are different communities that need to engage in that, and that happens at different levels. And I know we get into trouble for harking back to regional planning, but one of the most representative organisations I was ever involved in was the Regional Assembly, because in the South East, there was 112 members, all 74 local authorities were represented, but the other third of the Assembly was made up with economic, environmental and social stakeholders. And between the 112 members, we probably had a reach of literally hundreds of thousands of different people that were involved in different ways in supporting long-term growth. So I think we have to look at the different groups that need to be involved in this. And I think the other really good example was when we had community strategies, which sat alongside sort of the planning side of things, where there was a wide range of different interests and diverse roles involved in developing sustainable strategies and how that involved the plan making. So I think we need to look at how we build on past, but we've also got some really good examples, and I know Andrew's involved in some of the developers forums, and I've been involved recently with establishing a new one for Surrey, where this is about strong collaboration across development industry and local authorities, but other public sector agencies as well. This isn't about just sharing information. This is about genuine collaboration and everybody with an interest of doing something better. So I think we need to also look at these sort of models, and of course the actual community. And I would say I don't think local democracy works very well at the moment, and I think if this gives us an opportunity to improve that, then all the better. Let's get some proper representative democracy into planning. The second very brief area was when Eric Pickles got rid of regional planning, he got rid of the blame game. He said that didn't work. Well, again, I disagree. I think the blame game worked brilliantly. In the last 10 years, we've spent the whole time arguing over housing numbers and not about vision and about placemaking. And I think trying to take the heat out of that and having that somewhere else, and if that means being set at a national level, so be it. If we can then focus on the really important things around placemaking and the things that really matter to communities, then I think that's a good thing. And then just my final point is, we are looking at digital communication. We're looking at different ways. I think Cambridge City are doing some fantastic things around engagement with local communities. But I think we need some much better expertise within local authorities to manage this. And I'm not talking about, within the planning side itself, but I think we need to invest more heavily in local authorities around how they engage more generally. The white paper suggests that we will have potentially just one consultation stage in the local plan making. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be engaging on an ongoing basis with local communities of all different types, but that does need resources and that does need expertise to support the planning side and everybody else that has a role to play in placemaking. So I guess that would be my 3 points. Define communities, get everybody involved, invest in the resources, and move away from arguing about numbers to actually what matters to communities in the first place.
Thank you very much, Catriona. Very strong set of points you made there. I'm going to next invite Andrew Taylor to give your views. Over to you, mate.
Thanks, Jonathan. And pleased to be here speaking on behalf of Countryside, and pleased to be able to sponsor this event. And I think we wanted to sponsor and work with localists on this, particularly because that community engagement element is really important from our perspective. We develop houses across the country, but a whole range of different scales and different contexts. And I'll give a few examples in a few minutes about how we've engaged communities and hopefully taken people on the journey where we are. But it's that genuine community-led development or community engagement, participation, and it's how you get that genuine element as opposed to some of the things that have been discussed. I mean, I've seen a launch of a website this morning at one local council, which I'm not going to name, but people have said, well, actually, it's impenetrable. I can't get into there. So it's not necessarily, I can't understand it and I can't feel it's right for me. So technology is not necessarily by itself the be all and end all of everything. And I'll slightly disagree with Samir, because actually one of the significant benefits in one of my examples was actually the amount of information we provided direct to people's doors, backed up by the technological aspect as well, but providing the information direct to where people are so that they can engage and they can understand what's there. But when we're going back in terms of the proposals in the white paper and looking at the local plan stage, trying to get people engaged at that level is incredibly important. There's a couple of comments about neighbourhood plans, I'm sure we'll touch on those, but getting people to understand and engage at that level, to bring forward their issues with, I mentioned Claire's point about social infrastructure, but also on the environmental issues and the economic goals there, that people can bring these right up front to enable the officers and the councillors to understand that fully as part of the mashup that is required to develop that local plan and that vision. Not everybody is going to be happy with the outcome of a local plan, and that we've got to say that very clearly up front. There are going to be winners and losers, but there needs to be a clear vision that the councillors and officers articulate, and that's got to come from the key issues that have been identified, the strengths and weaknesses within each local authority, the development pressures, the environmental pressures, or the gains that can be delivered. But taking that through then, the master plans and the meat on the bone of actually seeing the development come through. I want to mention East Hertfordshire. I've seen a couple of people on from Hertfordshire, which is great to see. But the way East Herts and the leadership there took through the local plan and then worked with each allocation to bring the community together to develop the master plan, it was significant leadership from the leader of the council and senior officers to take people along on that journey. Not everyone agreed with the outcome, but they could understand the decision-making process and the balance of issues all the way through. That's a really good example. We are working with Kingston Council on the development or redevelopment of the Cambridge Road estate. And we're talking there about moving people around, changing where they live considerably, demolishing and rebuilding on a phased basis. And therefore taking people through that stage. What does it mean for me personally as part of that redevelopment is incredibly important. People can see a wonderful vision in 10, 15 years time, but how you get there, how you transition through that process is really important as part of planning. And Catriona mentioned about the previous sort of social and community plans that we used to have, which went alongside the local plan in terms of engaging people and taking them through. And then my final example is one we've done recently in Chelmsford district with a large allocation for 1,000 houses in Southwood and Ferrers. In terms of a master plan process, we delivered a brochure to the 600 houses in Southwood and Ferrers, a lot of online engagement, webinars, podcasts that people could feed into. We had a much higher take up by all these different measures through the pandemic period. We had a much higher take up than we've had before, and actually a much better demographic. And one of the things that we always struggle with is reaching the quiet people within the community, reaching those who don't necessarily have a home and who might be wanting to live here in the future. Very easy to engage with the home-owning established community who might have more time on their hands. But actually how you engage with that broader range of people is really important. And using that broad range of techniques we found was really successful in taking that through. But then keeping the last point, keeping faith, I suppose, with the community in terms of them seeing the delivery of the things we've been talking about through the plan making stage, the planning application stage, and actually seeing that delivery. That is as important, and ensuring that engagement continues through that delivery phase so that people can understand when things are going to happen, understand the issues about delivery, and making sure that they can comprehend and buy into that process. Sorry, Jonathan, thank you. I'll pass you back.
Andrew, many thanks indeed. But thanks for all our first four panelists. I think it's great pleasure to introduce Andy von Bradsky to give the MHCLG view. As you said, must have been deluged with so many submissions, consultation submissions. Be very keen to get, Andy, your sense of view of direction on the role of community in placemaking as you currently see it. So if I can ask you to unmute, introduce and speak to us, please.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and a good morning to everybody. Thank you for this occasion to speak. It's coming right at the end, I suppose, of the consultation process, which terminates tomorrow evening at 11:45, so make sure you get your responses in. I have to say it's been a huge level of responses already, and the amount of resource that's being dedicated to just analysing it is quite awesome. Obviously, the white paper has generated a huge amount of interest. A lot of aspiration in the white paper, so how the policy detail will flow from that, including, of course, how communities are expected to be involved more closely in plan making, needs to be worked out. So I think we all accept that there's a lot more detail that needs to sit behind it. I think it's worth just going back to some of the core principles of the white paper, just to restate them. The first issue of three, I believe, is central to it, is certainty. So greater certainty for developers, greater certainty for communities in terms of what is delivered through the planning system. Enabling speed of delivery, so improving the rate at which new development comes forward. And the final point, which I suppose is my main interest, is around quality. You will see a lot of reference to quality in the white paper, and my role leading on design code work at the moment, and my interest, I suppose, is in improving quality across development in the UK, in England. The basic premise being, if quality is improved, communities are more likely to support development. So will quality be assured in a revised planning system, and what should the role of community be to ensure that? Just turning to design codes, which have been mentioned in the white paper as being a fast track to beauty. And let's just unpack that statement a little bit. Beauty doesn't mean just how things look. The coding work that we're doing at the moment is going to look at all the ingredients to what make places attractive and loved, which is certainly not just about how places look, which is sometimes a misinterpretation of the use of that word. So we're preparing guidance at the moment for local planning authorities to prepare codes. I have to say it relates to the current planning system, not the future one. So this is guidance that relates to planning practice guidance to fit with the NPPF, and it will be launched later this year. But of course, it will inform the nature of planning design code, the use of design code in a new system. So design codes are important because they provide that framework for creating distinctive places with a consistent and high quality standard of design, a three-dimensional representation of a local plan that can be visualized more easily as part of a planning system. Communities' involvement in that. Codes provide, I suppose, greater certainty for communities about the design of development, serve as a visual tool, and are going to be much easier in theory to engage with. They bring conversations about design to the start of the planning process rather than at the end, and provide a more specific steer on what's acceptable, rather than the local plan books that are very difficult to understand, interpret, and understand what the likely development is going to be. Of course, codes provide developers with greater certainty in terms of planning permission, and they can speed up the process, as we talked about earlier. Communities must be actively engaged in this process up front if we want to bring democracy forward, which is the sort of tagline for the white paper. And of course, we've done this in many places. It's not a unique experience to have really positive engagement with communities. We have done an awful lot of work in capturing the best experience in planning practice guidance at the moment for the engagement of communities. That includes face-to-face engagement, workshopping. All those tools and techniques are out there. They can be done. They can be made use of. And it's able to be mainstreamed depending, I suppose, on resources. So 3 points just to make, and apologies if some of these have already been touched on. Skills and resources in local planning authorities. I think that investment is recognised. I hear what many of you say about the need for that, and I think government recognises that there is a need for training for officers and communities in relation to design coding work. So government's already acknowledged that by setting up a steering group to look at a design body that will support local planning authorities in delivering local codes. Chair's been appointed and a panel will soon be announced to help shape that. And of course, in the white paper, we refer to a chief placemaker in local planning authorities, and that really raises the kind of profession that I'm in, the built environment expert, to participate more closely in the plan making process and guide it locally. So I see that as being really a good move towards strengthening the local authorities' capability and bringing architecture and design right up front. We've mentioned digital engagement. I think part of the problem of community representation is the very narrow spectrum of people that often get engaged in local plan making at the moment. How do we widen that out? How do we get a younger voice and harder to reach groups who wouldn't engage necessarily in workshops? And I think we've all learnt, as in this sort of experience, how to engage more positively through digital media. So how can we use technology to strengthen engagement with a wider cross-section of the community? And of course, how can we use digital to visualize and help people understand the kind of development that might be proposed for their area? The final point, which I don't think has been mentioned, and I think it is really important, is how you measure support. You know, it's not just a question of engagement, but it's also a question of measuring support, and how do elected members and the communities actually come to a conclusion about the nature of development coming forward. And I think that will require local authorities to determine some kind of methodology to actually help with shaping that. I think I've said too much. I've gone over my 3 minutes, as I think everybody has, so I look forward to the discussion, Jonathan.
And well, look, I'm very grateful for yourself and all other panelists. You've gone over time, but I think we've had a lot to say, and it's about equal time anyway. We've got half an hour for Q&As to pick up some of the themes that have emerged from the opening statements. So yeah, rules of the game: put your question in the Q&A box. I'll come to those immediately. For those following on Twitter, the hashtag is plan4community. Take that away. Some immediate questions. Got two related, really, from Jonathan Flowers and Claire Richards. This is really, though, Jonathan makes the point, neighbourhood plans seem to be a reward for areas with high levels of social capital for volunteers and or areas with active town or parish councils. He asks, is there a way we can help other neighbourhoods achieve the same benefits, or are they inevitably doomed to rely on the catch-all local plan? So is there better ways of engaging? And Claire asks, raises the question of social infrastructure or social heritage. Is there another emphasis to sustainability we can place? So, Victor, I'll give the floor to you. Put your hand up first and ask the panelists to consider those issues about better engagement.
I'll just add a reflection, if I may, on the areas, the sort of the well-heeled areas, if you like, that do really great neighbourhood plans, as opposed to the areas where it's hard to reach. I think I come back to the point on resourcing, and this is speaking from personal experience of going into an area where there wasn't so much engagement with the community, partly because the local planning authorities just didn't have that resource to go out and have those conversations. And bringing that resource in a way that, you know, running a planning department that was well funded meant that we could go out and hold engagement events in a community where the community were, you know, falling over themselves, say, finally someone for us to talk to. And it's great that you're putting these events on, because we're getting to know other people in the community and we're getting to have the conversations we wanted to do. So I think it's not so much about those points that were made, although obviously we recognise them. It's about the resourcing point, that if you do have the resources to go out and hold events, whatever they may be, you know, I cited an afternoon tea party, but we would do mince pies at Christmas. The community was so grateful for these opportunities that that the funding wasn't there otherwise. And it, you know, okay, it was dressed up into a social event, but actually we were talking about local plan matters. It was local plan engagement. So I do come back to this resourcing point. It's not rocket science. If it's resourced, you can go out and do proactive engagement. But what we've seen from research at the Royal Town Planning Institute is, you know, 40+% cuts. Most of the worst of those cuts over the last 10 years in local planning authorities have been in local plans. You're talking about strip back to the basic statutory stuff where there isn't any over and above exactly what you need to do engagement. So I think if it's resourced, if the government are listening, and I'm hearing some positive noises out of Andy there, if they're genuinely listening and come up with that package of support that local planning authorities are crying out for, they can go out and do that engagement, that positive engagement with communities. And, you know, I think that works both sides, really. Communities want it too.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Anyone else want to come in? Samir, did you? Samir and then Andrew.
Lovely, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for that, Victoria. I mean, I agree it is about resource, and I'm obviously, you know, cheering for the, I think it was the 370,000 for local authority in your letter on the CSR. I think that's important. I think it's also important to work with local authorities and planning teams how that's spent. I mean, on resource, I would add its leadership and its visibility, because, you know, it's, how do we get the planning officers out there? I mean, I'm struggling at the moment, you know, it's because we can't get our planning officers to go and do site visits for all sorts of reasons that can't be got into here. And that makes a difference to people on the ground, because they're sensing that actually decisions are being made, if you like, without that sort of engagement and interaction, which is fine. There are all sorts of reasons why that is, but I think that visibility on the ground is important. You know, if I get an email from a resident that says, look, we've got issues with transport. Transport appears to be a big part of any development, as you would expect, you know, alongside design. What I would do is I would say, well, let's meet, you know, and we've actually met during, you know, post July 4th, out on the streets. And, you know, I've heard things like, well, this is the first time I've met a councillor in 23 years coming to hear about a particular problem to do with a simple thing with traffic flow. So that visibility, that leadership on the ground is important, because people want to see that A, you're genuinely interested, but also B, that then you are chasing the solutions with officers. And, you know, it might be a resource that's blocking that, but I also think there's something else going on in the system. Just looking at Jonathan's question, which is neighborhood plans are reward for areas with high levels of social capital. I mean, in a sense, I agree. I don't think it's a reward, but I think certainly areas where you're endowed with, you know, retired solicitors, retired planners, retired architects, and so on, you are certainly at an advantage, you know. And I'll give you the example of Hope. We've got 2 neighborhood forums side by side. And actually, that's exactly the scenario where one is heavily resourced with retired planners, retired solicitors, and so on, and has been going on for 8 years. You know, right from the beginning, actually, it was, you know, the team has been on the ball for a long time. And then another one that's now coming up for renewal of designation, and they've struggled, you know, because for 5 years they didn't have the leadership. They had a forum, they had a committee, but didn't have the leadership to take things forward. So, you know, it took us a year since January last year, coming on to a year now, to work with locality to get the funds for the tools that we believe the forum actually needed. So we did a housing needs assessment. Don't think the officers took that seriously, but that's fine, because it's where we are in the process. And then we did a design code, and we worked with ACOM and with locality to produce one, because we thought, well, this is what we want the neighborhood to become. But again, that wasn't picked up, if you like. So we've now ripped that up, and we're back to the drawing board, because we thought, well, there's no point in doing something that officers don't see eye to eye with, for example. But it's coming back to that point about people and heritage and what they believe is needed. But it's how do you then shape that support internally, because you're obviously struggling with internal dynamics within the forum, within the committee, the various things that the community actually needs, the external piece with the officers, locality, and ACOM and everybody else you're working with. And you know, that needs a lot of support. You know, I agree with Jonathan, is that, you know, how do you stop that from becoming an ill-fated neighborhood forum? So it's that level of, if you like, support for neighborhood planning. I don't know what it would look like after in the legislation, but I think it's important if the tools are there for the communities to take advantage of. And just one last thing, I think Victoria mentioned earlier on, you know, people moving into areas, safeguarded spaces and so on, so that they become engaged, you know, so that upstream and downstream engagement as well. One of the things the design code for a neighborhood forum does, it's meant to safeguard, if you like, some sort of space for people moving into the area. And we have the tools, you know, so we worked on life stage modeling to see who moves in and out of particular areas so that we begin to anticipate needs. But again, we weren't getting much traction because we were always getting trumped, and this is multiple occasions last few months, by the windfall site argument, i.e. things that we were setting aside for the local community were getting trumped by people coming and say, well, this is a windfall site. And we were saying, no, it's a family home. No, it's a windfall site. And again, you get into things which then put people off, I think, internally. And then how do you keep that level of engagement up? It's a lot of time and effort, I think. But I don't know how, you know, again, the question is there a way we can help neighborhoods achieve the same benefits? I don't know, but it takes a lot of effort on behalf of a lot of people to keep that momentum going. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumit. Andrew Taylor, you're up next. How do you respond to this?
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'm going to take a step back because my initial comment is I'm not sure that the white paper necessarily supports neighbourhood planning or leaves much left for neighbourhood planning to get its teeth into after the local plan process, design codes, allocations, master plans have all been dealt with as part of that process. We've been working with a few across the country where we've been working with the parish council, in this case rather than neighbourhood forums, the parish council, to bring forward more detail on local plan allocations, or actually in some cases allocate as well. And I'd agree with Jonathan that most of the time they are within better, well-heeled areas potentially. But then it's actually, I'd argue that it's not necessarily the resourcing of the local authority that's necessarily key. It's the capacity building for the local community to enable them to bring forward their views. I've been involved in my government life. I was involved in a number of neighbourhood plans, going as an officer or senior officer, supporting those plans through. But the most engaged communities, and the best way of doing it is actually, it's got to be the community's plan. They have to have their own ownership. It's not the local authority officers coming in and doing it. They might support, guide, direct. It's actually having the funding. Samir mentioned locality, obviously that's another way of funding, but it's bringing in a trusted individual who might not be the local authority, because quite often there's a difference here between the communities and local authority. It's actually about bringing in an additional trusted person to provide that capacity building to enable those communities to articulate what they want to do and put it in the format of the neighbourhood plan needs to be in. And it is possible. I was talking about the regeneration of estates earlier. It's identifying those key people within those communities who you can work with, help them to capacity build, help them to articulate the issues, and then work with them to set the plan going forward. But it's also, it's not then being in that straitjacket, I suppose, in terms of what is a neighbourhood plan necessarily in terms of the allocation side, but it's making sure it has a broader vision in terms of the community development, the aspects of positive nature. We talked about social infrastructure as well, or the hard infrastructure that needs to be provided. It's thinking slightly further afield than just thinking, oh, it's an allocation or it's a way to stop development. It's a way to enable something to happen or resolve problems within the local community. Can I be cheeky and just touch on Louis' point in relation to genuine interest? Because getting people engaged is really difficult. And there is a fear that if you put everything online, and there are a lot of online platforms now around and being used by councils, being used by developers and community groups, that you'll get 500 objections or 500 letters of support from Australia or America or whatever, and that just skews the development. I'm not sure in practice that actually happens. There was a case recently in where a local plan had failed, and there was a case about a petition coming forward, and actually I think that was garnered by the local community, and they'd got all their friends and relatives around the world to sort of make comments on this petition in terms of the future of the leadership of a council. I mean, that's not the way we want to go, obviously, but actually proper engagement online targets those right people, whether that's through Facebook ads or other types, in terms of actually targeting the people in the community within that area. So while it's on the website, actually the locational aspects of social media do really direct things to that locality and try and improve engagement with people. And actually, it might be that people who are not in the area are looking at moving into that area, or who need houses in that area, and it's therefore right that we do include and engage with a more broader aspect of people than just those who happen to live currently in the area. Thanks.
Many thanks, Andrew. I'll put those issues to Catriona and Andy. Anything you'd want to respond to, Catriona, on either the element of social infrastructure, community amenities that we need to take consideration of, which might be subject to oversight or omission, or that issue about how we can really use community planning to renew democracy or find ways of engaging communities which don't have strong social capital available to push things through.
Yeah, I mean, I think neighbourhood plans, from what I've seen, I'm not a great expert on that, but from what I've seen, are a good tool for shaping places. But I think we shouldn't all put all our eggs in one basket. And I think, you know, it's back to something that Victoria said about the conversation you have with people. They don't realise they're talking about planning when you're talking to them about various things. And one of my most recent experiences was in working with local authorities around Surrey around their place ambition, and we had a series of expertise round tables, and we finished off with one where we pulled a whole load of young people, sixth formers from my local secondary school, and then it included my own daughter, which was really interesting because we had a conversation around planning effectively with them, but we never used that word. And they said the most important thing in their community was that it addressed climate change, that it addressed things around health and well-being. And there was some insight from one who lived in a large site in my local area in Thames Ditton around the fact that it was restricted by covenants, so they couldn't they couldn't adapt their homes to deal with climate change, mitigate against climate change, because it was stuck with restrictions that were placed on it in the mid-90s. And you know, as a young person, she felt very strongly that that shouldn't be the case. There was other things around what makes a good place, and interestingly, a lot of them thought Woking, town centre and Woking, had a much better feel. And I think it's something that Andy said around good design is not just about what it looks like. It is very much about how a place feels to people, how safe you feel. And they felt that Woking town centre was far better than a lot of the town centres across Surrey because it had some real vitality to it. They had big screens in the summer and things like that when you were allowed to go to town centres and congregate. But you know, and if anybody in Surrey knows Woking, Woking's the town that gets the the worst publicity because it's modern. It's seen as not in the Surrey sort of design. It's not, doesn't reflect Surrey's old-fashioned market town approach. But they had a very, very different attitude, and I don't think you capture that through digital connectivity and discussions. They were round the table having a really good conversation about what mattered to them, and it was a very, very different conversation. But at the end of it, and this was the most telling thing, my daughter, who is, you know, she's 18, she said to me, "I didn't realize that's what you did for a living. I thought you were a planner." And I think that is, you know, that reflected the fact that we have the wrong conversations. So I think neighbourhood planning is absolutely a great tool for a part of it, but it must, and planning is part of it, but it's not the only thing. And we have to have much better conversations around places and what people want from their place and how they live, how they work, how they move around.
Many thanks, Catriona. Andy, could I ask you to respond to anything you've heard with a particular emphasis on those issues of social capital required for good, strong neighbourhood community planning, and that aspect of considering social infrastructure as part of the party too?
Yeah. Well, before I answer the specific question you just posed, I mean, just some reflections. I really agree with Andrew's point about training, enabling and facilitating. This isn't something local authorities themselves are equipped to do very often, and they will need to bring in people who are experienced in that and who can act as moderators, who can actually have an independent view. I think the example that Andrew mentioned about Kingston is very interesting, actually. I live in the same village as Catriona, and just up the road is the Cambridge estate, and Jonathan lives not far from that. So we're all quite close to our own local communities, and we understand some of those complex areas. But on something like Cambridge estate, you have a very clearly identified community, and you have a very clearly identified group of people who are influenced by the development that will happen there. That is a very difficult thing to do, to replicate on a lot of developments. I'm thinking about complex areas of urban sites where firstly a community might not be so easy to identify, and secondly a complex nature of interests in a complex area could actually sort of compromise decision making. So I really think you need that sort of expertise that oversees how you go about the community engagement. Picking up, sorry, and also you do have this sort of tendency to resist development. So how do you sort of avoid that, and how do you manage that? And that is probably one of the key issues in our area, is people actively resisting development as opposed to encouraging it. So how do you factor that into the process? Picking up your point about social infrastructure, I mean, I really get that point that Claire's made, that there's an awful lot of emphasis on economic development, on economic benefits, and of course, much more noise, and welcome noise, about the environmental impact of development. And I think government's really picking up the baton here and looking for ways in which the environmental agenda, the objectives over 2050 can be met in terms of zero carbon. So that's all really good. But very often the issues that prevent people supporting development is the impact on social infrastructure, health, education, parking, access to facilities. Those sort of issues are usually incredibly high on the agenda for people when they come to support development or not. So I mean, government is doing things like the SHIFT investment programme, which brings together in infrastructure investment and housing investment at the same time. I think probably that needs to be factored in very clearly, very closely into the planning policy changes. So how do you reassure communities that their local facilities are not going to be overstretched? That's all I can say, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Andy. So we're into the final five minutes. of the seminar now. What I think I'll ask each of our panelists in order to give me a very quick minute summary of where they, at the end of this, what we've heard from the discussion today. What do you see as the role for placemaking and community in development, and maybe any reflections from we've heard aspects of the digital engagement from the response to COVID that might be worth listening to or heeding going forward into the future when all the consultation submissions are safely in to be responded to. So I'll ask Samir very quickly, a couple of bullet points. How do you see things going forwards?
Fantastic, thank you, Jonathan. So for me, it's about systems integration. I'll give you an example. We're working in the Thames estuary with Ebbsfleet and Purfleet on cultural co-location. So health, culture, creative industries within two pilot areas. Big problem for us is cultural recovery funds. They don't necessarily go where we want them to go, or haven't gone where we wanted them to go, for example. You know, they're there, but actually that integration to where the funding is going at the moment, part of it is COVID emergencies, but also how that ties into for the creative industries. So that's one. The other one is also systems integrations with clinical commissioning groups, GP surgeries. You know, it's the same thing as transport. What kind of fires up in the people? You know, you've got communities, you know, screaming, I think, for a GP surgery. Nothing the local authority can do, or us as elected representatives can do, because that sits elsewhere within the CCG, and that is a separate process. I think integration amongst all of these should be part of what happens next. Thank you.
Thank you, Smith. I'll next invite Victoria. What's your kind of bullet point list for strong community-led development?
Well, just before I come on to that, I think that infrastructure point's really important, and it segues into another part of the planning for the future, which is how we pay for it all. But generally speaking, I think most communities acknowledge the need to deliver more homes or more things, not least because the way people are living, lots of kids living at home longer, etc., etc. Where are my children going to live? So they kind of get that. But generally speaking, if they're creaking at the seams because of infrastructure, they can't get in to see their local GP, they can't get the kids into school, they can't, you know, they're traveling miles to get into a school because everywhere's full up, then there is something that they want, and that is infrastructure. And having a conversation about that systems approach, I completely agree with Samir. It is actually within the control of the local authority to get GP surgeries if you've got a really clear development infrastructure strategy, and you can join the dots on the contributions and get everybody around the table in a sensible way. And we're going to be saying something in our announcement tomorrow on the white paper in terms of what we think the solution is for that. So I better not say any more, particularly not if my team listening now. I'll get shot. But I will just say that coming back to what's needed, that capacity building is actually needs to be integral within the local authority, not just bought in, comes in and goes away again. And so we see, you know, I will leak this bit. There's a really strong role for community planners. We'll not be the only people saying that tomorrow, but those community planners need to be embedded within the local authority for longevity, for the granularity, for the corporate memory, for want of a better expression. And so that is absolutely needed to work hand in hand with the community. And as Catriona says, they're talking about planning without really realising it, but it's doing community planning, which is what's in it for me. What do I, just being open and honest about what is it that you want and need in your community, and then looking about how we can work together to deliver that, in a very sort of open approach. So yes, I will come back to resourcing, but there are also opportunities for us to strengthen the structures, should we say, and I better shut up. We'll see what comes out on that tomorrow. Thank you.
Forward to tomorrow, Victoria. Thank you very much. Well done for keeping your powder dry. Catriona, very brief bullet points from you, please.
I guess I would take Samir's word, integration, but I think I would also put that into place leadership. And I think that whether you're talking about how we engage and the tools we use, how we plan and the tools we use for that, I think whatever tools we use, we need really strong place leadership from local authorities, and that is from the chief execs, that's from the political leadership, that's from the planning leadership, and that's about, for me, it's about using the right tools to engage, and not putting everything into a box. So a lot of the debate has been around one consultation on the local plan process in the white paper, and I will get back to that point, that doesn't mean that's all you do. And I think having an integrated approach with different communities involved, different tools used, but right from the top, it's about places, and move away from debates about housing numbers and get back to debates about places. And if we start from that positive approach, things like design codes and everything else should play their part much, much more positively.
Thank you very much, Catriona. Andrew, over to you. What's your brief summary?
Just a couple of very quick points. Great with what people have said. I think we need to be early with that consultation, but also open and honest about the things that people can and cannot influence. That's a really important part of that public engagement. There are some things that people just cannot influence, and we need to be open and clear about that. But that continuous engagement throughout the development process, both in terms of pre-local plan, local plan, master plans, and actually through the delivery as well, that continual engagement is key.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And finally, Andy, from the department's view, what would you like to see going forwards?
From a personal point of view, rather than a department point of view. Personal point of view, I think, you know, if you were to look at the impact of COVID on our mindset and our attitudes towards our environment, much more intense interest, I suppose. And I think if you did engage now with communities more positively in the way that we've been talking about, they'd be talking a lot more about health and well-being than about numbers or, you know, the facilities even. I mean, it will be such a big issue. You know, the quality of places is now going to be much more greater. The final personal point of view is how do we engage young people? I mean, this is about the future for our younger generation, not about, you know, the views of older people who've, you know, might I say, had their day and had their say. You know, I'd like to know much more about what young people want for their future. My personal view.
Thank you very much, Andy. And a very fitting note to end, thinking about the future. So look, I'm going to wrap this up now. Before I do, huge sincere thanks to our fantastic panel today for contributing so richly, leading the debate for us. Huge thanks also for everyone who's taken time to register to attend today. We'll make available a recording for those who weren't able to miss it, so you can pass on to colleagues. And huge thanks to Countryside Property for helping devise today's theme and sponsoring the programme for today. So on that note, I will let everyone zoom off either to their next wall-to-wall Teams Zoom meeting, work, maybe an early lunch and a walk if you can get it. Look, on behalf of everyone at Localist, thank you so much. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.